In practical terms, if we put the philosophies aside, really the explanation is that we're looking for happiness. And happiness for the human being turns out to be peace of mind. So if that's what this process is about, the movement towards happiness, it makes sense that we have a good understanding about what that is. And it turns out that happiness, which is peace of mind, continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And when we look at what peace of mind, we find that that's the absence of suffering. That if we're going to have a good understanding about happiness, we really need to have a good understanding about suffering. You can't really talk about having a good understanding about nothing. And in a way, you could say happiness is nothing, because in practical terms, it's the absence of something. The absence of something is nothing. So, given there's not much you can understand about nothing, we might as well understand that which gets in the way of nothing. And understanding that which eventually dissolves is very much part of the process of it dissolving. Why is that the case? Well, in short, it's because the suffering is always a movement of mind. And in order for that movement of mind to dissolve, it needs to be understood by the mind itself, by the intellect. It needs to be understood by the intellect that that is an error, a mistake. If it's not understood as a mistake, then there is nothing within the system interrupting the system. As soon as the system understands, oh, that's a mistake, an error, not in a way where we are judging and criticizing, that would be a continuation of the mistake. But when it's just understood, oh, that's not optimal functioning, then the system will auto-correct. So the movement is a movement towards happiness, towards peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. Suffering, in practical terms, arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So whenever guilt is in the system, that is suffering. Whenever blame is in the system, that's suffering. Whenever pride is in the system, that's suffering. Whenever anxiety and worry is in the system, that's suffering. Whenever expectation about how life should turn out and resistance to life turning out a particular way, that is expectation and attachment to outcome, that is suffering. So they are really simple, clear descriptions of very simple movements that arise within us from time to time. So at least now, there's no reason why we can't have more familiarity, more awareness around what suffering is. Which then means when it arises, it can be recognized, and it can also be investigated. It can be unpicked. It can be observed. What are some of the observations that we can have about suffering? Well, let's define suffering in broad terms again, so that those broad descriptions can be part of what we start to observe. So suffering is based on two underlying belief systems. That I am the doer, the creator of my thoughts, of my feelings, of my actions. And that the other is the creator of their thoughts, feelings, and actions, and hence outcomes. And the second part of the basis on which suffering grows is the belief that the outcomes that are a result of my functioning and the functioning of the other, that is my doing, that I was in control of. The other part is that the belief that those outcomes are what will contribute, what will cause my completeness and my happiness. If it were true, we would be in precarious position. It would really mean that our happiness is really dependent on how well we function in life and how lucky we are in terms of outcomes, and very much how the other performs. All of that would be a determinant of our happiness, which would be a pretty scary state of affairs, because we would need people to cooperate with us, with me. We would require people to do what I need or what I think I need of them all the time. And each time they don't, that would be an attack on who I am, which is not so good. So that's something that we can investigate for ourselves in coming to understand suffering more fully. Investigate that in practical terms, suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, worry and expectation, and that at the base of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation, there are two fundamental premises, two fundamental beliefs. I'm the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is dependent on outcomes. So these are pointers, these are descriptions that hopefully become part of our up-to-date conditioning, part of the intellect, part of the working mind. And then automatically, as life presents, which it's going to continue doing, moment after moment after moment, when it presents in a certain way, which includes the arising of blame, let's say, blame for the other for parking in our parking spot, then in that moment there may well be an investigation that just happens spontaneously. It happens spontaneously because suffering arises and we become aware of, oh, this is suffering. And maybe we say, and I can see that the suffering is based on the belief that my completeness was dependent on someone not parking in my parking spot. And the belief that that person could have and should have created this moment differently to the way it is. Which really means investing or projecting onto that person the role of creator. And each time we look at the blame, we'll see that it is held together by the notion that what has happened is very important. I can't drop it. This is important. Because if we really said, who cares? It's not important, we wouldn't be the suffering wouldn't be there and we wouldn't be investigating it. So the fact that it's there means that in the system is saying this is a big deal. It is pain delivered by the other, and that pain is an attack on my happiness. And if it's guilt and shame rather than blame, we can look at the movement of mind and see that the story is I didn't perform well enough. I parked in someone else's parking spot. And I shouldn't have done that. Me, the creator of that moment, is what the shame is saying. Me, the creator of that moment, should have created it differently. And the fact that pain was delivered to the other was an attack on who they are. Both of which are misinterpretations of the workings of things. One, you didn't create that moment. You were forced to function in such a way that that outcome was what was delivered. And even if we are being objective and we say, so that did cause pain to the other, because they did come to their parking spot and find it was filled with another car, and it did lead to them missing an appointment. And you could say on some level, relative to certain benchmarks, that's not very good. So even if we do see it objectively, hopefully we don't fall into the trap of believing that that pain was an attack on who that person is. Was it really an attack on their completeness? Or was it simply life delivering what life delivers all the time? Some pleasure and some pain. And in this case, it was pain. And expectation, when that arises, we can see that we have an idea of how life should be turning out. And it's relative to that idea that we feel frustrated when life turns out the one way that it always will. And we're unhappy that it didn't turn out in line with the picture we had in mind. So really at the end of the day, all of these descriptions, hopefully, turn into an automatic functioning within us that runs interference on a habit that has been set in place by our design, and our changing design is now running interference on the existing and previous design. And that interference, that saying, well, actually, it's not really like that. That interference starts to undo the deeply ingrained beliefs that are at the core of the suffering. And the deeply ingrained beliefs start getting undone because the system is now being equipped with understanding of its own that is being developed from an investigation of life that says, no, that's not an accurate perception of life. I'm not the doer, the other is not the doer. Life is a predetermined story unfolding according to God's will. When I talk about life, that includes our own internal feelings as well as the external circumstance. Life is this single momentary experience that includes both of what we might call inside of us and outside of us. So I'm sure some of us have come across various concepts that might have been useful at a certain time, like everything is happening for a reason. Could be a concept that I know at some point was a bit of a mantra that then got a bit refined into something that then was even more appropriate. But at some point that was the mantra, everything happens for a reason. And I believed that at the time. What that meant, everything happened for a reason. What did that mean to me? Well, I guess to me it meant that life is a much bigger picture than just my story. And it was also an appreciation that even if I look at just my story, that what is happening now that might not seem so great could lead to very great things. And so starting to appreciate that the movement of life is much bigger than I can understand, and that, as I saw it, everything is moving in a way that is delivering what I need, none of which are necessarily absolutely correct. It might not be the absolute truth, but at the time it was something that really resonated. And what purpose did it serve? It was very simple, is that having understood simultaneous to this that I just described, that it is a resistance to life that is what tends to disturb the present moment. A resistance and an attitude that wants things to be different. The intelligence within the system, the intelligence within teachings that were being delivered to try and upgrade the system so that it started to function differently, knew that that mantra was valuable. Valuable because when the system went into resistance, which really was based on a belief that what is happening is not appropriate, this other thought arose. Everything is happening for a reason. And it's like, I can stop with that other story that is saying this shouldn't be happening. And it was replaced by everything happens for a reason. So that's just an example of how a concept can be extremely useful at cutting off suffering, at undoing a belief that is in the system that is not helpful. And then at another point along the way, the mantra was a little different. It's all good. So someone says, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to meet you the other night. It's all good.
But when you said that another, the concept can cut off the suffering, but can be also that this concept become a belief and belief cut off the suffering. In the moment.
Well, actually,
it's like a changing for the another one, which maybe relax you in that moment.
In fact, it is. That's why teachings don't often tell you that what they are putting forward is a concept, because the way that the process works is that we need to believe something as truth. in order for the new belief to uproot the old belief.
But also, maybe if consciousness is really synced in, that can be just understanding which cut of the suffering.
Yes. So that is where we start refining at some point the concepts that make sense to us. At first, in our spiritual seeking, we tend to believe a lot of things that, in hindsight, we look at it and we go, well, I was a bit deluded back then. You know, I believed that, well, what did I believe? Yes, but yeah, that I'm thinking more about God, for example. I believed God such and such. At some point, what is this God? And if I look back at the belief about God within a sort of spiritual concept that was used to undo something, say, wow, at that point I really did have an idea about a God that I now don't at all see that notion of God being anything that could possibly exist. And that, in a way, is the refinement of the spiritual process, where even the concepts and beliefs that we are happy to run with really start to be refined and questioned. So at first, we tend to believe a lot of concepts, and then at some point when we start looking for evidence, we start having to adjust those concepts so that they become much more palatable to us. And yet we look at those concepts that might have been in the system earlier that now are not palatable to us, and we see how useful they were, even though they were in fact a belief that was unverifiable. And as we start to become more capable of discerning what is a belief that is unsubstantiated versus a concept that we're happy to hold as valid, at least from a relative perspective, that is a sign of maturity in a sense, because one of the habits of the human being is to draw wild conclusions based on what we're told, or to believe as truth something we're told. And the process is very much about, if you want to describe it in broad terms, the end of belief, especially the end of believing concepts that simply aren't how life is presented when we start seeing it free of the psychological conditioning. So if we go back to the concept, it's all good. In a way, when that started being applied, it was a way of diminishing the old pattern of being sort of positioned somewhere on a spectrum and saying, okay, anything that is on this side is good, and anything that's over there is bad. And then finding that our experience of life was heavily correlated to where the outcomes in each moment landed on the spectrum, whether they landed close to what we considered good or whether they were more in line with that which we considered bad. And then our experience was either one of like appreciation or of aversion and pushing away and resistance. So it's all good was confirmation and affirmation that actually even those things that are not so great, in the bigger picture, are very valid. So it was breaking that habit of attitudinal resistance to pain and confirming to ourselves or to the other as part of a deepening that actually that isn't an attack on who I am. You know, the fact you didn't turn up when you said you were going to turn up, no biggie. You know, I survived. I am, and even when I was waiting for you, I realized that I was. So it's all good. So these concepts will really serve at cutting off suffering, the habitual suffering, by introducing a different understanding that doesn't permit the old suffering based on the misunderstanding to hang around unchallenged. And if the new understanding, when it arises, doesn't cut off the suffering, which it may not do, at least it allows us to see the suffering as a story that's running, that isn't truth, yet there is something in the system that still allows it to generate. So there is a witnessing of it, an understanding that it's there, an acceptance, a recognition that it's there, but knowing where it comes from. So the mantras, the concepts that come out of this framework that at some point replaced a lot of the others were, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. The flow of life is pleasure and pain. What that means is the flow of life means circumstance as it's going to present from the time we were born to the time we die. There is always going to be circumstance when we are in daily life. And that circumstance is either pleasurable or painful on the spectrum of pleasure or pain. And somewhere in the middle you could say there is neutral circumstance. So if we understand that, then life isn't such a mystery anymore. Well, at least in regard to this, we know that the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. So when we feel pain, when someone takes something, when someone is aggressive towards us, when someone is emotionally abusive to us, it's understood that's life. So is there anything that can happen in the flow of life that you can't say that's life to? So that was another mantra, that's life, that's life. These things happen. Even if, and this is not to be insensitive or to diminish this, if someone that we love is hurt or killed or sick, the truth of the matter is that's life. Now it doesn't make it nice. It doesn't turn pain into pleasure. Life is always either pleasure or pain. So when someone we love is sick or dies, that can be pain, it will be pain, but it's life. So if we can become clear that the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain, and that our happiness depends on our attitude to the pleasure and pain. Now, if we don't know that the flow of life is always a mix of pleasure and pain, and is not my doing or the other's doing, but just sometimes uses this vehicle and the other's vehicle to deliver the pleasure and pain, if we don't know that life is a mix of pleasure and pain, and we think life should be pleasure, 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 then what do you think our attitude towards life is going to be when life delivers pain? Well, it's going to be an attitude of resisting, having a commentary, an attitudinal commentary about what has happened. And if we become deeply ingrained in us that the flow of life is always going to be pleasure and pain, then when the pain is delivered to us, the commentary might kick in, saying, this shouldn't be like this. And then something deeper says, actually, that's life. That's life means life should be like that. So those three concepts, hugely important if we can really understand what they mean, rather than them just being a belief that we're repeating. So the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. It's not a hard concept. We can observe life, and we know that if you've been on an aeroplane for 30 hours, you could say that my feeling now is one of tiredness, and that feels painful, for example. And then the next day there is the appreciation of new places, new friends, pleasure. So we've observed life enough to know. If someone can convince me from experience that life isn't going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, then I'd be impressed. Because my observation has shown me very clearly that at any moment life is changing, and the change is either going to be in line with my preferences, which means pleasure, or out of line with my preferences, which means pain. So the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. My happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, meaning my happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. My happiness is not to be found in life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. And thirdly, I'm not the doer, the other is not the doer. So the last two need to be verified from one's own experience. My happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. We've been seeking pleasure, pleasure, pleasure for our whole life. We've received the pleasures from time to time that we have been seeking. And from our own experience of having received those pleasures, we should know by now that yes, it's very nice and pleasurable, but pleasure is short-lived, it's temporary, and it doesn't actually deliver continuous, unbroken happiness. You can't take the pleasure you received, at age 14, you were named the best person on earth, and you can't take that forward for the rest of your life and use it as some magic wand that gives you permanent happiness. So from our own investigation, we can conclude, actually, I have received pleasure in life and it doesn't deliver happiness on an ongoing basis. And also from our experience, but from the other side, we might start to find that even in the face of painful circumstance, we can find a place within us that we can rest in and find that it's not such a big deal. Even when someone we appreciate a lot is no longer in our life, we can feel the pain and then hopefully drop into a place where we realize, but I am complete, which really means it's not as big a deal as it seems when we can't connect to that place inside where we can verify, even in the face of this unfortunate circumstance, I am complete. So if in the course of life continuing to be what life will always be, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, we are able to touch in more and more regularly to this part inside of us that is always available and is always at rest and complete, then from our own experience we can say, my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure and pain, because I'm happy even when life is painful. And remember, happy doesn't mean joyous excitement. It means the absence of the psychological resistance that we're very familiar with. And the last of the three mantras, I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. Which really means in each moment I'm functioning according to my makeup, according to the organism's makeup. The heart, which is an organ within the organism, the heart is always functioning exactly according to its design. So when it skips a beat, it's doing that because of its design. It might have some plaque or whatever happens in the heart that causes it to start to beat irregularly. That plaque has altered its design, and so its current design is now functioning with an irregular heartbeat. And the human being overall is a complex organism, shaped by life, designed by life, always functioning the only way it can. And that doesn't only apply to oneself, but to the other. Doesn't make what you do or what the other do pleasurable. It doesn't make it always pleasurable. It means you will contribute to the nature of life, the nature of the flow of life, which is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, based on your functioning, based on the other's functioning. We'll have to experience the pleasure or the pain, but hopefully our attitude towards that pleasure and pain isn't an attitude of blame or guilt or pride in the way that it so often is when we are convinced that I am the doer and I should have and could have acted better. That the other is the doer and should have and could have acted better. So if that's the way we see ourselves and the other, we're always going to be judging our actions and the other's actions. That judgment is based on a misinterpretation of life. So the mantra, I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, hopefully starts to cut off the judging which is based on the belief that we are the doer and the other is the doer. So if someone were to say, yes, but the other could function differently. That's where I might give up, because I understand that that's the attitude that is in that person. It sees that the other could function differently. I'm saying, but they can't. You might wish they could. But that's like wishing that the toaster is going to wash the dishes, right? Why would you wish that? Would you spend any energy hoping that one day you'll wake up and see the toaster washing the dishes? It's like, what a waste of time. And not only a waste of time, if we can see the dynamics, like we say, how on earth is the toaster ever going to wash a dish? It isn't designed to wash dishes. And that's the same principle that will hopefully allow us to see that in each moment a person is going to act according to their design in that moment, based on the circumstance that they find themselves in. And that's the only way they can act. Anything else is just hypothetical. And yet, if someone is sort of saying, well, I'm not quite sure, yesterday they acted very differently to the way they acted today, so I don't see why they couldn't have acted the way they acted yesterday, today. I sort of understand why, because of the way life presents, someone will think it's quite feasible for someone to have acted differently. Like, I get it. It's completely wrong, in my view, but I get it. And what's important, really, is that we get it. If someone is blaming us, that's not the blame that is suffering. That's the blame that is suffering for them. But the blame that we receive from someone isn't our suffering. The suffering which is our blame, that arises in the form of guilt, blame, that suffering is when we blame the other, not when the other blames us. When the other blames us, that's pain in the moment. Yeah, if we believe what they are blaming us for, then that's our guilt, and then that's our suffering. If we blame them for blaming us, then that is our blame towards them, and that's our suffering.
Just a simple question regarding the part that life is either pleasure or pain. Isn't there something in between, like when we don't care?
Yes, that's... so I had said in between the spectrum of pleasure and pain, there is you could call neutral zone in the middle. But actually, neutral probably doesn't really exist. We are probably never actually neutral. What we are, it's probably either very, 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 very mild pain that is registered as irrelevant. So in practice, that's neutral. Or very, very, very mild pleasure that in practice is neutral. Or you could say, well, the temperature like this is It's neither pleasurable or painful, so it's neutral. But in fact, from another perspective, you go, this is brilliant temperature. This, what you're calling neutral, is so pleasurable. Imagine if it's 8, 10, 15 degrees hotter, then it's painful. You know? So yes, it's a technical question. You might as well say there is this big neutral zone in the middle, which is where the flow of life is. Technically, I would still say pleasure or pain, but in practice, neutral. In the concept where we feel that my completeness is dependent on pleasure or pain, we wouldn't relate to this weather as a pleasure that will add to us. The pleasure that we're looking for is something less standardized than this. So we want the pleasure of, praise or success, fame, financial reward. So those are the sort of pleasures we're looking for. And similarly, the pain in life that creates resistance usually is something more extreme.
Probably I shouldn't address this question to you because it is about something that another spiritual teacher said that I heard. It's from Rupert Spira, if you know him.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could comment on what you think that he means by that. And he said that the teachings are there to kind of weaken the sense of personal doership. He calls it the separate self, but it's basically the same. And he says that the separate self might come back with a vengeance because it knows that its days are numbered.
Mm-hmm. So, if I'm here talking about life being predetermined and that no one is the doer, that everything is a happening, the belief in personal doership can hear that and say, hang on a sec, what are you talking about? And it can understand that this pointer, this concept, is an attack on its existence. And so it can kick in and resist that concept. It can get into an argument over the concept and go storming out of the room in a way that is, it's self-preservation. And if the identity is of a certain intensity, the exposure to spiritual teachings can be very uncomfortable, because the spiritual teachings are essentially attacking the very ground on which that identity rests. And that identity wants to preserve itself. So it will fight back against the concepts. So if we picked a group of people from the streets and said, come and sit here, and the concepts were presented, I know because I've experienced talks where the profile of people is very different from the average talk where people come here because they organically hear about it and come because it resonates. When you have a group that haven't come for that reason and the concepts are put forward, the energy in the room is very different. People, instead of for 2 hours people sitting quietly and still, there's people moving around, people looking around the window, looking at each other, getting up and leaving, because the identity simply doesn't want to surrender to what is being said. Doesn't want to be open to that information because it knows that that information entering the system is essentially the beginning of the end for it. Does that answer the question?
I was wondering if it could also happen that the suffering is reduced, but one day it comes back and it feels even more intense than before.
Well, yes, there is also the phenomena that as the concepts come in and start undoing layers, that the defense systems start to get shut down. And as the defense systems crumble, there can be a feeling of peace. And then a shift happens, a part of the flip-flopping, where we go from this peace that has set in because a whole layer of the suffering dynamic has collapsed, and there's a sense of, this is great. And then you wake up one morning and a fear or a judgment is there in full force. And where did that come from? And one of the explanations is that the doership and the attachment is contained, locked away in the body or in the mind. You can say in the mind, but the storage location is the body usually. And so as the defense systems start to crumble, these energies that have been suppressed and locked away start to make their way out of the system. Because you could sort of look at it as though there's all these trapdoors that have chains on them. And as certain beliefs start to crumble, the chains start to break apart. And then the trapdoors start opening up. And energies that are in the system start coming to the surface. So there is a period where you really are going through a flip-flopping phase. And that can be synonymous with these repressed energies being ready to be released into the system. If the repressed energies were released into the system all at once, we probably wouldn't be able to deal with it. We wouldn't have the resources to investigate, we wouldn't have the space to see those energies and to be able to process them. So the energies come up at their right time, and that right time is usually when layers of other suffering have been dealt with. And usually when a layer of suffering is dealt with, there is a period of quietness and peace. And then the next layer comes up, which can seem like the suffering coming in with a vengeance. Really what it is, it's a deeper, more intense form of suffering that you couldn't have dealt with before, coming up now at the right time when it can be dealt with.
Hi, I have a question about, previously you talked about God, and because I often have some conversation with a friend of mine about the existence of God, and we argue, because she says, of course there's a God, look, haven't you read the Bible about all these apostles and the Christ story and all these things? And then I go on saying, this is what you've been told in school and in parents, this is your conditioning. And then she says, okay, all right, and how do you know there isn't a God? I mean, maybe you haven't seen it, seen him, because you are not fulfilling your duties.
Mm-hmm.
Your religious duties. You don't go to church and you don't receive Holy Communion, so of course you haven't seen a God. So how can you say there isn't a God? Where do you base your argument? So we keep on arguing if there is a God or there isn't a God, so, and there isn't any conclusion about that. So when I tell her, okay, so many sages have said that, and that there isn't. She goes on. So the apostles said there is. So we don't go anywhere with that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, what's your opinion about that, and how do you define atheism, or that?
I wouldn't say definitively there is no God, because that would be the same error as saying there is a God. I would find that place outside of needing to take one side or the other and be content with, I don't know. What I would say there is no God is to a specific notion of a God that is once, as we surrender into I don't know more and more, we start to see that beliefs that we had before are exactly that. They're a belief where we think we know. And then when we realize I don't know, we start to see the unlikelihood that that particular God exists. Because when we look at the belief and we see, wow, that really is a very fanciful idea of God, and we can track back where that fanciful idea comes from and how it's very much related to a psychological movement of the human, like a anthropomorphizing of God, and a creation of a God based on our way of seeing life, which is a God of separation, for example. So it can be that I wouldn't say that absolutely doesn't exist. Because if we ever are absolute about anything, we are making a mistake. Because we can't, that's one of the faculties of our thinking, or one of the characteristics of the faculty of thought, is that it isn't absolute. But if we see that that idea of God is an idea of God created by the mistaken thought that thinks that things are a particular way. So any thought that thinks it can know what God is mistaken. So that God doesn't exist. The God that the thought says exists doesn't exist. How can thought know what God is?
Then there is a question, like, would you believe in God when you see the God? Like, I know that you are here, but if I didn't saw what I heard about Roger, I can just believe, to have a belief, like the Roger is existing.
Mm-hmm.
But I accept that maybe it's existing, maybe it's not. But when I see Roger, there is not a belief, because it's an experience of Roger.
Yes, so my answer is no. Because so the question is, would you believe in God if you saw God? And my seeing of anything is as relative as my thinking of anything. So what I see is an appearance that isn't confirmation of truth. So if God appeared in the room and said, I am God, it's okay, nice to meet you. But that doesn't mean now I believe that there is God. I know that there is an appearance in my experience, and that appearance is telling me that they are God. But I might find out that I'm schizophrenic, and that appearance of God was not as absolute as we might have related to it. What if, someone who says, I know God exists, I communicate with God, I can understand that what they're referring to is an experience that they are calling their communication with God. And that can be real. That's a real experience. But it doesn't actually prove that a God exists, because we can drop into a place inside of ourselves and feel something very different to our ordinary experience, and we can call that my connection to God. What if it's your connection to what you really are inside? What if all it is you connecting to you? But because it's not what the person normally experiences in life, and they only experience it when they go into church and they pray, and then they say, that's when I'm in union and communion with God. What if that's when you're in union and communion with yourself, and it's so unfamiliar that instead of calling it union and communion with yourself, they say that's union and communion with God? So I'm not one to say that life is not profound and life is not mystical, but I'm quite happy to say that I am part of that profundity in life, that all of us at our core is profound and mysterious. And if we only know ourselves as the very tangible and much more knowable aspects of ourselves, when we touch into the mysterious, then we might start to say, well, that's God. Instead of, that's me, that's I. So, someone with a conviction that there is God might be basing that conviction on an experience that isn't actually proof of God. But we come from somewhere. We come from somewhere. So that's, to me, that is my source. And if I was going to relate to anything as God, I would relate to life as we know it, the force of life as God. The force of life is my God, as in, I came from life. So I am always connected to life. I am spawned from life, and I'll subside back into life. This is why we have, at a funeral, from ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Meaning, from ashes we came. Ashes really is just a representation of the 5 elements, which is a representation in gross terms of life. So the mixing of the 5 elements creates this complexity. And part of the complexity is the human being. And so it's really saying that the source of the human being is the 5 elements. And the 5 elements are the source of life. Now, where did the 5 elements come from? You can keep going back to sources until you can't go back any further. So in non-duality, there is a notion that God is nothing. Absolute nothing. And from absolute nothing, everything emerges. Intuitively, the reason that's there is intuitively we can touch on this nothingness. Not the nothingness that's there when we're just in beingness, because that really is not... I understand why people call it nothingness, the formless being, but actually there's all of this in that. And there's the sense of existence, and there's a lot of things that, to me, mean that that's not really nothing. But in deep sleep, or as you go from the waking state into deep sleep is nothing, not even the presence of awareness, absolute nothing. So it's sort of a poetic framework to say that the source of the manifestation is nothing. That when we go into meditation, when meditation happens, the experience becomes simpler and simpler and simpler, to the point where, in its most basic form, there is simply the senses have withdrawn, and there is presence. So you could say that that's all that there is presence. Not presence with a world, because the world has collapsed. Just awareness and beingness. That, to me, is not at all nothing. That's very much something, presence and beingness. But we can see, we can touch on and have a sense of that going to nothing. That even that, what's left, the presence, disappearing. Now we can't have the experience of that, because absolute nothing is the absence of presence. So anyone who is waiting to know nothing. So even if you have an experience of void, that's not nothing, because there is something registering void. And so when you come back, you can say, oh, I remember this time that I had this experience and everything was wiped out and there was just void. I go, yeah, that's a peak experience. It's not nothing, because if it was nothing, you wouldn't be here you wouldn't be able to talk about it. So the fact that you can talk about it means there was awareness in that experience. So that's not nothing. Nothing is prior to that. And there is we have an intuitive sense that in meditation we get down to the very basic presence, and then even that turns off. But we don't know that it's turned off. We only know it's turned off in the moment where presence comes back. And then there is a sense that, oh, I'm back. And so there's a sense that there was nothing for a while. But that doesn't prove that everything comes from nothing.
forgot my question. Oh yeah. The flip-flopping that you've alluded to, is that synonymous with the layers? Like you said, like when a layer of deeper suffering comes up and gets cleared out, then that's the experience of flop? Or are those different?
Well, flip-flopping can be part of a clearing out of a layer. So flip-flopping can happen within the clearing out of a layer. And then you can also have a flip-flopping where a layer has been cleared out and there is a period of peace, which is the flip. And then a deeper layer that needs to be processed comes in and fills the flip with flop. So that's where the suffering comes back in. So if it's the flip-flop within a layer you have a lot of sub-layers, I guess you could say. And each time a sub-layer is cleared out, you'll have the flip. And then a sub-layer of that layer will come up and you'll be in flop. And then once all of the layers in that layer are dealt with, you have this flip again. And then the next whole layer comes up, and then you go through another process of flip-flopping within that layer.
Like for life, or how long does that go on? Because for me, it's been years now, I feel like it keeps getting less, like the suffering, and sometimes for months there's none, and then all of a sudden there is. But yeah, obviously there's an end, right? And I guess I'm also asking if there's like a catalyst.
I've found, in my experience, there's an end to the flip-flopping, because that's synonymous with the end of suffering. And it was very clear point, in a sense, when that flip-flopping stopped, because in the period of several years there wasn't much suffering at all, but there would be short periods which would be the flops, and it was very evident. And there was one particular misunderstanding, the one, let's say, the one that I call the last. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying like it's the end of process, because to me, process doesn't end. This is a process of life, and life continues until we die. But we're talking about the end of a specific phase of the process of life. And when this one last issue that I didn't have all lined up correctly, once that lined up, it was like, and the internal struggle around that particular topic subsided. And I didn't know that was the last one. But in hindsight, I came to see, that was the last one. There were no more doubts, no more questions, and no more flip-flopping happening after that. So what that points at is the fact that the flip-flopping is linked to remaining misunderstandings. So the one I'm talking about was this misunderstanding I had around anger. And Ramesh used to make it clear that biological anger, biological sadness, or let's not call it biological, but pure anger or pure sadness, or just anger and sadness, you don't even need to add the word pure to it, is a biological reaction and not suffering. That's one of the concepts in the teaching. And I'd hear that, and I'd go to my experience, because that's what you tend to do once the self-inquiry has got to a certain point. You're not really interested in just taking concepts, but you need to verify them based on your own experience. And if your experience doesn't match the concept, hopefully in time the concept changes your experience so that it matches it. Now, my experience didn't match the concept. And at that point I was faulting the concept. So my experience was when there's anger arising, that was suffering. Like I feel it, so I'd say to Ramesh, look, I'm sorry, but my experience is that when anger arises, I'm uncomfortable with the other. And it's very, not just, I'm not just saying conceptually I'm uncomfortable with the other, I can feel an uncomfortableness, which I'm very familiar is suffering. And Ramesh would just keep reading, Roger, anger is a biological reaction, it is not suffering. So I'd go, once again, in the course of life, anger would arise, and I'd be very interested in feeling it and inquiring into it, and I'd go, once again, this is not a biological reaction, this is suffering. So again, I'd say, but Ramesh, my experience, and Roger, anger is a biological reaction, sadness is a biological reaction, not suffering. So I had a struggle with this. At some point, it dawned on me as I was going through life and seeing anger arise. So the particular situation that happened was I was in a hardware store and I bought a hot dog as I was walking into the hardware store from the local Scout Association or whatever. I got a trolley cart, and I finished my hot dog and I scrunched up the hot dog wrapper and threw it into the corner of the cart. And then was walking through the shop, through the hardware store, went to get something, came back, and my trolley was gone. And I saw this man with a trolley with the scrunched up hot dog wrapper in it, and I go, oh, he's picked up my... So I went up, I said, excuse me, I think he's got my trolley. And he goes, this is my trolley. I said, well, mine was here a minute ago. I went off, I've come back, it's not here. And that one looks like mine and it's got my hot dog wrapper. And he goes, are you telling me I took your trolley? Oh, I said, well, I'm just telling you that I had my trolley there and it had a wrapper in it. It's like that one with a wrapper in it. So he calls over his wife, hey, come, this guy says I've got his trolley. So at that point I felt anger arising and I felt the uncomfortableness. And then I said, it's not worth it. And I said, that's fine, it's your trolley. And I walked off. And then it dawned on me, because I was thinking about this for the next 15 minutes, inquiring into it. And I had Ramesh's words in my head going, Roger, anger is a biological reaction, not suffering. And I thought, what if he's right? And what if I am relating to anger as if it will not arise after the understanding is total? And what if biological anger is always going to have a place even after a full understanding has happened? And I said, if that's the case, then I don't need to resist it. And it dawned on me that I had an expectation around anger ending with the understanding. And then I saw that that was actually an attachment to pleasure, 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 because when biological anger arises, it's not pleasurable, it's painful. And then it clicked and I said, well, if I've got a wrong expectation about a biological reaction that is just pleasure, then my attitude towards that biological reaction, which is just part of the flow of life, part of circumstance, is going to be an attitude of resistance, an attitude of not wanting it or not seeing it as valid. And I sort of thought, this is very big, this is very significant. And once again, it fit into this pattern of Ramesh telling me something, sticking to his guns, me disagreeing with it, and time again, me being shown I was wrong and he was right. And so in this moment when I could, for the first time, understand how I could be wrong, how what I was calling my experience, because when I went to my experience, that was suffering, that wasn't a biological reaction. But now I had some new information, in a sense, which was a result of my deduction, and that was, what if the uncomfortableness that I'm feeling simultaneous to the biological anger is actually expectation, and not the anger itself. So what I was feeling as the uncomfortableness was not the anger, but the expectation, the attitude towards the anger. But because attachment to outcomes sort of pervades the pleasure or the pain, you can't distinguish it until your understanding of it allows a distinguishing of it to happen. Now, in that moment where I had the insight, I wasn't really able to verify it because the anger wasn't there for me to examine. But the insight was like, it was like, oh, really? Wow. What if he's right and he's right on this basis? And I was sort of right in saying that this is not a biological reaction of just pain, this is suffering, but I wasn't right because I was not really referring to the anger itself, but the expectation that still existed in the system. So the insight was there, and then it was 2 weeks later that a situation arose where anger arose, and for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by expectation. Because that moment in the hardware store where the insight was that maybe I have an expectation around anger, and anger is actually a biological reaction that will always arise depending on circumstance and the person's makeup.
Okay, so everything you're saying is really resonating with me, and where I'm feeling challenged is like one of my teachers in the last 10 years was Byron Katie, and like faithfully every day for like 3 years I did the work. I did inquiry on beliefs, and I started to notice where I experienced anger kept getting less and less. But now my mind is like attributing the experience of anger to failure somehow, like, and then I think just my dad had anger issues growing up and it had an impact on me, and I don't want to be like that with anyone. And as a woman, there's more conditioning, it seems. So I don't know how to, there's something blocked and stuck with that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you can see it, that's something I'm not seeing.
Well, if you describe what, the very fact you said, my anger was like that, it impacted me and I don't want to be like that. That's an expectation. Okay. Point blank expectation. You may well be like that. Surrender to it.
I'll tell my husband you said that. I'm just kidding. I don't outwardly show it. I clench at night, and I think there's just a lot of suppression. I don't know if it's anger or anxiety or what is stuck, but it feels like there's something stuck in my system, and it's been years, and something in me feels like it's in a hurry to get rid of it, which is also an expectation, isn't it?
That it's an urgency to get rid of it, did you say?
To get rid of anything that's left.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not bad in its sense. That urgency can be linked to earnestness. It's about finding the key that will allow that to happen. And if the dynamic I just described is actually what the key has to be, surrender to anger arising and you getting out of the way. Now, that can sound very counterintuitive. One, because we think this is not going to be good for my life. And two, because we assume that if we get out of the way of anger, there's going to be a whole lot of anger. And in fact, what might be coming up if it is suppressed stuff, is not really anger, but hatred or blame, because biological anger is different to psychological blame. Biological anger is someone comes and pushes you back into a dangerous position, and you respond with anger. And once the situation is over, it's over. It's not the same as blame and hatred that comes from doership and attachment to outcomes. So this allowing what you call anger, which is probably actually blame, the allowing, stepping out of its way, is actually part of the release process of that which is suppressed.
Stepping out of its way means what? To sit, like meditate?
Not having an expectation that it's not there, and not manipulating your functioning to not allow that to express.
Could you say that last part again?
Yeah, so not manipulating your experience or not manipulating your behavior to be the not angry one. And the irony is that if it is suppressed blame rather than biological anger, as that has an outlet, the system starts to become more clear, and then we find that our tendency to feel, anger/blame changes. Whereas when we're modifying our behavior, which essentially is keeping that energy suppressed, what we find is that we are going to be continually having to be very mindful of how we're acting, because that energy is going to be triggered regularly, want to come out, and we keep restricting. So what sounds like counterintuitive, the get out of its way and allow that to express, might actually be something that leads to much less of that resentment being in the system, which then means that there might be a period of turbulence, followed by a change that is sort of unexplainable based on your previous experience. It's like, wow, this person can do this, and it doesn't create a frustration or a resistance anymore. But until that suppressed energy is allowed to come out, we're going to continually be fighting that feeling and modifying our behavior.
So is it like let it have its life in the body, like let it burn, or what do you mean?
Just if you can see that there is an expectation that says things are going to be better if I don't get angry, and you can see that actually is a form of attachment to pleasure, then that seeing is enough that it will guide the process.
Thank you.
So, to finish off the story, it was 2 weeks later that a situation happened. Maybe I did finish the story, I don't know. My dogs were about to chase after some kangaroos. I was holding onto a lead. I was straddling a barbed wire fence, and they're 2 40-kilo dogs, and if they take off after a kangaroo, I'm going to get pulled, and my thigh is going to get cut by this barbed wire. And so I saw the kangaroos, I saw the dogs register the kangaroo, I registered my precarious position, and I either had to let go of the lead and let the dog chase the kangaroos, which isn't great, or I had to hold on and get my thigh ripped, which wasn't great, And so a biological intelligence yelled at the dogs with a lot of anger. And the dog's attention suddenly went from the kangaroos to my command. And I then stepped over the fence and realized in that moment that for the first time, anger arose without any judgment of anger. And when I look at it, I think, what a biologically appropriate response to the situation. It wasn't personal. It wasn't hatred towards the dogs. It was a biological anger that was completely appropriate in the situation. And in that moment, it was like, he was right. Anger is a biological reaction and not suffering. I had anger arise and there was no suffering. So it became clear that what I had experienced in the past was not just anger, but anger plus expectation. And that was the end of something I couldn't reconcile for months, maybe 6 months. I just couldn't reconcile, and it was the lack of reconciliation was coming up with all sorts of stories that was making Ramesh and questioning Ramesh's understanding, and maybe it was just an excuse that he was using to, allow anger, all sorts of things. And when it became experienced, it became very clear that that was my misunderstanding. And that seemed to be the end of the flip-flopping and the seeking process. And there were maybe 5 or 6 other keys along the way that fell into place in a similar way. And each one was, subsequent to that last one. Previous to the last one. And essentially they were layers being cleared out. One, just to give you an example, another one was the belief that what we were looking for was a state of oneness. And I was having lots of peak experiences of oneness. And Ramesh told me one time, he said, "Roger, that's just an experience, don't worry about it." And I was saying, well, that's enlightenment. Because when those peak experiences happened, it was exactly in line with the awakening teachings that talk about you are consciousness, you are awareness, everything arises inside of you. And I couldn't reconcile that until one day it became clear that there was some suffering arising because I was waiting for this oneness to set in and be a oneness experience where there was no sense of a person, and for life to be lived like that forever and ever. Because I really thought that's what the process of enlightenment was. And because I kept having peak experiences that would last for periods of time, and I had a subtle sense of that all the time, I thought, well, one day it's going to be this very pronounced all the time, like the peak experiences. And Ramesh, when I described this particular happening to him, "Roger, that's just an experience, don't worry about it." And it didn't make any sense to me for weeks and months, until one day I registered a suffering, which was an expectation, a waiting for it. And in the same way, this thought came up, what if he's right? What if that's just an experience? And then I got it. I go, actually, all I'm looking for, because this is part of the teaching, and it had become very clear outside of this expectation, all I'm looking for is peace of mind in daily living. And then, what if he's right? That's just an experience, that's not enlightenment. Enlightenment is continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. And who cares if the continuous, unbroken peace of mind is experienced from the perspective of a human being, who is experiencing life as a life of duality, where the chair is not what I am, where the other is not what I am, maybe as some fundamental theory, because everything is made of the same stuff, like the 5 elements, or prior to the 5 elements, atoms, or prior to atoms, energy, prior to energy, nothing. So in theory, maybe I am everything. But I was waiting for the theory to become experiential, and there were peak experiences of that, and those peak experiences of that are just so that we can understand that it's sort of like a behind-the-scenes look, where we can understand, yes, in theory, everything is consciousness. Then the error is if we think that enlightenment is the experiential living of being consciousness and the ending of the sense of duality. And then, that dissolved, that expectation for oneness dissolved, the peak experience stopped. I don't think that was a loss whatsoever. They were there to me to demonstrate something that was demonstrated, and then they can stop. And then the peace in daily living got deeper, because expectation for the state of oneness to be some continuous expression of life fell away. So I realized, there was another expectation about what enlightenment was.
Can I ask another question, or does anyone else want this? A couple of the other people I've seen in the last few years are like Tony Parsons and Jim Newman, and I enjoyed them, but I felt like every time a question was asked, it was just like, there's no one, and then sort of that it's a non-experience and all of that. And I guess where my mind is questioning right now is, what does liberation even mean? Like, I don't know that it doesn't mean anything to me, or am I missing something with that?
What does liberation mean?
Yeah,
it's a concept when it's put forward. The concept of liberation in this teaching framework is liberation is the end of suffering.
Okay.
In another teaching, the concept of liberation will be something different.
Okay.
So in another teaching, the concept of liberation might be the end of duality.
The me falling away, right, is what they talk about, or the me dying. And I guess I have a question, like, do you still experience like an imaginary character in your mind every day called Roger, and you see a past version of him or a future version of him, and you think that's you, or that's done, like, that's not you?
What I sort of experience and know myself as is this human being that has a body, that functions in a world of time and space, 3 dimensions. This body has senses, it has thoughts and feelings. There is a consciousness that is not separate from the body. And so that whole package, to me, is what Roger is. And so Roger knows himself on all of those levels, including especially, it's very important to know oneself, including the beingness and the awareness, because that's the aspect of the human being that is not known when there is a lot of suffering. So at that stage, we know ourselves as a person, but a lot of aspects of the person are not recognized. So we could say we don't know ourselves fully. And because of that, and because of some fairly significant beliefs that exist in the person, in the body, mind, organism, we know ourselves as a person And we have the experience of feeling like things are missing and lacking, feeling that I'm the doer, and which really is what the me is. The me is the sense of personal doership and ownership and attachment to outcomes. So when that set of beliefs falls away over time, through a contemplation, an understanding of what the spiritual teachings are pointing at, a seeing of the me entity, which really means a seeing of thought in action, and understanding that thought comes from beliefs, and seeing, well, who is this me that says they need such and such in order to be complete? And we'll see that it's simply a thought. So the me is contained in the thought, I need such and such in order to be complete. We don't really, this in order to be complete is not, the thought is, it as by feeling the feeling. When we are resisting something that someone is taking away, that resistance is telling you, I believe I need that. And we'll see that me is really just that belief system, that thought. And the seeing of it tends to diminish it, tends to break the intensity of the habit, and that essentially is that flywheel that has that momentum, getting slower and slower and slower until it no longer is there to turn around. And so then you're still left with a human experience, because the body is still here. The person, we always were a person. We always will be a person. The question is, what does the definition of the word person? And as I'm saying it, well, person is an entity, an organism with consciousness. And the question is, how do we know ourselves? What presents as our experience of ourself as a person? And so if there's no experience of the mystery of when we dive inside ourselves, then we don't know ourselves as the person we can know ourselves as. If there is the presence of the me thoughts and beliefs, then we know ourselves, but we know ourselves as a person with a certain experience. So if someone says to me, someone did recently, a teacher, he messaged me, sent me a friend request and message, and said, I pretend to be a person for the sake of something, I don't know what, I can't remember what it was. And I thought, wow, he pretends to be a person. Interesting. It's like, because I don't pretend to be a person. I think I'm a person. I know myself as a person.
Which self? Which self?
Well, the self being myself, meaning the experience in the present moment is there is this at the core of the person. There is what Ramana, for example, talks about the self with capital S. So that self with capital S is referring to the impersonal being. And impersonal doesn't mean it doesn't belong to the person. It just means that when we rest in it, which we could say is the core of the person, we know that I exist, but resting just in that I amness, the sense of being male or female, being 10, 50 or 80, having preferences is absent. But that's not necessarily knowing yourself. So that's coming in contact with the self that is the backbone, you could say, of the experience of being a person. And so if we rest there, we find that that self is not at all personal. It's free of characteristics, other than the characteristic of existence or being and awareness. Those are the faculties of it. And that's very important, to become aware of that self, because that's what we're generally not aware of. So all of the pointings that say you are not a person, you are the awareness, you are the being, you are the formless essence, you are, they say you are not the person, you are that, simply to move your attention onto that, because the attention is obsessed with the gross that we're very familiar with, obsessed with this at the expense of the self, which is a very intrinsic part of the person. And so that's why I keep reiterating that teachings are not the truth. They are concepts, they are pointers that are useful for allowing us to recognize what is being pointed at. So if a teaching says, you are not the person, you are not the body, I don't care who says it. God can come down, the God that doesn't exist, and say it, and it's still a concept. And if we take it as truth, if someone says, but Ramana says that you're not a person, you are the self, and the self has no gender and it has no age, I say, yes, he says that, it's a concept. And it's very useful at pointing at that aspect of the person that hasn't been recognized. And once it's been recognized, Ramana would be the first to tell you, now forget what I said. Because that was just a thorn, which is a tool to uproot the embedded thorn in your thumb. And the embedded thorn in your thumb is the thorn that says, I am this, and it's a belief, I am the body and the body only, and I need X, Y, and Z, and I'm the doer, and all of that. And so the pointer that says you are not the person, you are formless awareness, is moving your attention to that essence that is so essential. Once it's done its job, once it's uprooted the belief that is preventing that from being seen, then Ramana suggests you throw the concept that you are not the body, for example, away. Because if you don't, he says that's going to get embedded as a belief, and you'll go around believing that you're not a person. You'll go around being a person that believes they're not a person. Instead of having thrown both thorns away and just knowing yourself as you are, so that self, the yourself, which at the core of it has the self functioning, being there. And if we know ourselves in such a way that suffering isn't part of the experience, then there's, in our own experience, there's nothing more to do. Because life then is lived happily, and all of the uncomfortableness isn't there, and the seeking that is really a response to the uncomfortableness isn't there, because the uncomfortableness isn't there. And so then when someone starts talking about, I'm not saying this because you said it, it just fits into the thing. If someone then starts talking about, aliens or God or you are consciousness or your awareness, you go, oh, well, who cares, really? I just going to live my life as Roger. And then the question, but where does Roger come from? And the consciousness that is functioning through Roger, that is the consciousness of Source. I go, well, I don't know, but I don't need to know. But it's very important that you know, because you need to know where you come from. And I say, I've realized along the way I can't know where I come from, but I know that I am. And that's more than enough. That in each moment, I know I am. Which really means in each moment, if I forget, I can, and then there's a remembering, I drop back into being. And if we don't find ourselves getting dragged out of that being, it means that we're grounded in being, living life, doing whatever we need to do given the circumstance, which is really destiny unfolding, doing whatever we're designed to do given the circumstance. And that's as simple as life gets.